Here we are kind of in the middle of this getting to know your markets course, and our friends just popped off, but they'll be right back on. I'm just going to give that summary of like where we've been is looking at getting to know who our market is and what kind of a customer that we want to be selling to, and understanding the pros and cons of like what those different market streams are and kind of how we interact with them as like business owners. Which ones do we want to do, not want to do, and why, and kind of have that perspective so that now as we are moving into this latter half of the course is talking about like how do we then grow for these customers. And so once you kind of know who you're growing for, now we get to dive into like what, when, how. And so these next classes, so today we're going to be talking about the harvest calendar. It's like a really simple, fun, easy to get into tool. And I was always surprised. It was always something I wanted to like skip over in my crop planning process. But have really found that, understanding the seasonality of our product is really important and helpful when planning for our crops. And also really good for communicating too. All of my florists are asking like, when do you have your mums? And it's like, well, really just for these 2 months, and so helping educate our customers about when they can expect certain things. So yeah, we'll go through this harvest calendar, and in that we're also wanting to get some like poundage and like quantity. So we're going to also be talking, today, or as you're filling this out, thinking of like you're doing a CSA, like how many CSAs, if you're making a product, like how much product are you kind of thinking that you're scaling to? If you're going to be selling to like one restaurant, two restaurants, three restaurants, and like how much salad mix would you sell to one, and then scale that up. So kind of we'll be thinking in quantity, so when and how, and then we're having a quick turnaround. So next week, hopefully you can have a chance to finish this harvest calendar. It should only take maybe like an hour to 3 hours, depending on how complicated your crops you're thinking of are. But next week we're going to dive into spreadsheets and numbers. So that's my heart and love. And so I think we're maybe going to have May from Foodshed hop in on that call, or at least she'll chat with me ahead of time to help me make it right size so I don't get too carried away in the spreadsheet land, because I can really go there. But the spreadsheets are intended to help us understand, okay, so if we have a 25 member CSA, or if we're going to be selling X amount to Foodshed, what kind of income can we expect from that? And also, like, are we signing up to sell our products at a cadence that we can actually achieve? Like, and we actually have the labor to support that harvest and those efforts. And so I like these spreadsheets because they pretty much take a look just at your individual enterprise and run like what's your profit can you expect, and also takes a look at your labor, like how many hours is that going to take. So I have templates for a lot of them. Like my farmers market one, it might be my weakest, but I have a good one for CSAs and direct to wholesalers, value added products, and selling to Foodshed. And so you can really take an active look at like, okay, how much money am I going to be making? And again, how much labor is that going to take? So at least gets you, I really want you to be thinking in those terms of, yeah, how much work does it take to actually grow this stuff? And really how much money can I be expecting? Because we won't be talking about in this course, although it's another love of mine, is the finances and the numbers. So having these enterprise budgets to get a realistic sense of like what's that cash flow income that you can be expecting throughout your year, and the expenses side of all your calculations. They kind of come with time, and to the degree that you choose to be in compliance with different requirements and your choice of like how much marketing you're doing or not doing, if you're paying yourself, not paying yourself in your first couple years, if you have labor or don't have labor. And so for many of us, it's like, this is what we are doing. And so our labor costs, we're not hardlining those in always necessarily, but we should be. to some extent, but really thinking of your time, because your time is your finite resource. So that's the message for next week. And then we'll have office hours after that. So, we can be working more on some of those spreadsheets and numbers. If you really want to get into it, I can troubleshoot some spreadsheet stuff with you. And then after that, that's when we're going to get into crop planning itself. So we're going to look at a couple different tools for crop planning. And then actually, how do you calculate it? We're going to really use basic Excel spreadsheets, but I'm going to promote, Tend and this other spreadsheet that Jose found as tools to help you do your crop planning. But we're going to start from the beginning and really understand, like, okay, how do you actually crop plan? What is row feet versus bed feet, and understanding some of this nomenclature. And we'll dive into that in class. And then I have actually 2 sets of office hours after that, because crop planning can be quite the beast to get into. And so we'll dive into that. And then at the very end, looking forward to having like a conversation on just like how do we approach it? How do we time manage? How do we create a culture for ourselves and for the people around us so that we can actually implement this crop plan in a way that's it's probably not going to ever be perfect, but we can be iterating every year to get it closer and closer to something that's in alignment with who we want to be and how it fits for us. So that's the overview, where we've been, where we're going. And yeah, let's jump in to harvest calendars. Has anybody seen like a harvest calendar before or used one? Oh, I see a little nods, some nods in all the ways. I popped this in the email, but I'm going to pop it in the chat too here, because I have 2 harvest calendars. I could not put my flower one, because if anybody wants to grow flowers, like, I want that to be an open resource for folks. But I am going to be pulling up the veggie harvest calendar. Perfect. Harvest calendar. And so cool. I see somebody else on here too. So this is great to make a copy. Oh, I think I'm supposed to say something else. So really, there's like 2 sheets in here. When I first was, if you're just starting out and just thinking of this, starting with this non-CSA harvest calendar will help you get thinking about your crops in a more approachable way. But it is categorized into these different groups. So I feel like alliums, greens, main items, fruits, and herbs. Just because when I was at Wild Willow and Annalie was running our CSA program, that's how she thought of it. And I loved it. She wants to think of like every week somebody needs like a leafy green of some sorts, maybe 2, maybe 3, because like what kind of CSA do you want to be? And then like, green onions or some kind of allium, your main items, your big hitters that most people are coming into your CSA for. Well, maybe they're not coming for fennel. I don't know. And then your root crops as well. It's like some of these like staples. So herbs. And then, I don't have fruits on here just because those are, I guess, typically not, but man, we should let's put it on here, huh? I do think like strawberries and melons are really great additions. And if you have access to like, maybe especially for your CSA and you're like thinking of like, oh, well, I have my friend, he's got the citrus tree and I know this person, they have persimmons, and like you're bringing in fruit from outside sources, that those are something you'd want to be adding in. So there's room to add stuff. Strawberries. Right. Cool. So yeah, so that's kind of like how there's value-added products in there too. Fun. how I've thought about thinking of like planning is like creating this like structure. You know, some folks really want to lean in on the leafy greens, and that's kind of how their farm is set up. Whereas other farms are like, I don't want to do anything that I have to do wash and pack for because I don't have refrigeration. And so, you know, this has a list of like a lot of crops, but you know, you thinking too of, you know, catering this to be like, okay, who am I? You know, we talked about our markets and our products. So adjusting this so that, you know, it's reflective of, um, you know, really what your truth is of like, what are the flowers you're growing. When we first did this for flowers, we didn't really know what we're doing. We put all the flowers on there, and then it was great to see that. We tried a lot of different things, and then over time we're like dwindling that list down. And that's like one approach, or it's like starting small and then adding things on it. So depending on who you are as a person, too, I think is your approach. um, I don't know, does anyone want to add on to like kind of how they're starting to think of like what products they would have on here? Um, Anybody want to or have any questions? No pressure. We're just creating a space for anyone to think or add.
Yeah, this really helps me figure out how I should lay out the season, especially dealing with more native plants,
Mm,
harvest them because that information's not so easily accessible sometimes. Um, so yeah, just having this and knowing like, oh, like I'll be getting coffee berry around now, so then I can start
mm.
doing the different things with that. And like blackberries are finishing up, so if we wanted to do anything with those, we can harvest them before, like more in September than now. And yeah, I really like this layout. It's very
Yeah.
forward.
You know, especially too, I was kind of thinking of my like herb drying shed, you know. So when I was planning out the herbs, it's like I only have so much space in my herb shed. And so I'm trying to plan as well to be like, I can't harvest all the things in the same window because I don't have enough drying space, you know, or really seeing I have tons of drying space in the winter. I'm like, whoa, I should just be growing tons of calendula. And like, what else can I be harvesting in the wintertime? Is the mint going to be going off so that like I can balance the needs in my drying shed? And you're all thinking too about preserving and like, yeah, here's your blackberry season. Is that lining up at the same time as you're planting like apples and pears, you know? And oh, I just don't have enough time or kitchen space to process all of those things. Or like, and then the tomatoes, it's like, well, I'll plan for early season tomatoes so that that's not going to interfere over here, kind of thing. And so planning our production schedules in that way. And then as I'm like saying this, I'm just gonna like drop a little hint for later as we're doing our crop planning as well. One of the checks that I'm doing on my crop plan is how many trays do I have in a greenhouse at one time? Because I only have so much table space, but I'm really dictating that by like, what's my capacity to plant in a week? I'm like, I can safely plant, you know, 7 trays of plants in 1 week and no more. And so I need to be staggering how much I'm growing. So if I'm seeing I'm like really heavy in this like May and June, July harvest time, and I'm like, do I really need all these crops right now? Because I know I'm not going to be able to, one, harvest all them, two, probably plant all those. And so how can I say like, all right, you know, maybe I'm going to dial back, you know, cucumbers because those are really labor intensive. And I'll just have zucchini, which I know I can sell. And I'll be adding the cucumbers in lightly because I know, you know, all these other farms do the cucumbers really well. And so I'm not going to be focusing on this crop that's um, going to just be too much at a time when I'm already really busy. Um, and on that too, you know, Hannah and I were talking earlier just about the value of your bed space too, and thinking of and then it came on, and that's that podcast again. I was listening on the way home with the farmer Jesse and the new Farm Daily podcast he has, and he was also saying it's like you have one bed and you have so much time. Do you want to be harvesting your zucchini, which is like cents, you barely make any money, or would you rather have that same bed space for tomatoes, which is a higher value crop? And so that's, in that farmer also, he's like, well, I'm not doing those, but there's another farm and I just buy my product in from this other farm. And so really wanting to help people understand too, they don't have to be all the things to everybody and do all the things. And so I love CSAs, and I also know just how much work they are to grow all the diversity of things, and yeah, and just the effort to put it together. So when we get into our enterprise budgets, we'll take a look at what those actual labor numbers are. But maybe that's what works for you, or you have, yeah. So all those different scenarios. In talking about CSA, that kind of like leads me into, I did kind of start popping in here. So CSA is a great way to think about. I like it because it has this number of items per box per week, and it's going along in those lines too of like, well, how many things can I handle at once? And so this version of the spreadsheet has up here at this top number of items per box per week. This second sheet has more number of units. And so, if I'm saying 20, let's hope the sheets work. It does. I'm doing 25 pounds. Like, oh man, Coral loved our arugula at Wild Willow. She would do easily 5 pounds every week. And then I'm like, oh, I know another restaurant, they want another 10. So it's now up here, I'm getting this total number of pounds per week. And the CSA would require a little bit more where, is this where I put the 25? No, I'm messing up all the spreadsheets. Escape, undo. So this one doesn't have as much calculation in it. This first number was supposed to say like, how many CSAs do you have? And then somehow I put in 25 there. 25 goes there. So maybe I'll add in that little calculation here so you can, I don't know, tangent, spreadsheet, love, compartmentalize, go over there. But really trying to think, yeah, so now when I'm actually crop planning for arugula, I'm going to go ahead and take, okay, I want 10 pounds for my wholesales, farmers markets, all that. And I'm going into my CSA, and, every other week I'm going to be wanting another, 25 times 0.25 pound bags. And so having to do that extra set of math to get, okay, now I need 15 pounds, but I need a buffer. I'm going to say 20 pounds. And then that's where we get into our crop planning. We're going to say, okay, well, how much bed space do I need? A 50-foot bed gives this many pounds. And that's where we will continue to do that math in future sessions. But right now, we're just trying to get this core number of like, how much are we producing? And also what that season is. And so let's start talking seasonality, and we can get back into kind of numbers and quantity and circle back in so that kind of concept kind of gets ironed in a little bit more. But yeah, let's talk about seasonality because that's kind of fun to talk about. And it's good to be sharing information here. I'm like looking at here the faces, and I'm like, wow, somebody who's in Encinitas, someone who's in like Julian, and then someone who's like in the middle grounds. And so all those microclimates are very different, similar but different. And so how much season that we have in each of those is going to vary about how long that we can be growing something, specifically like our cool season crops, summer crops. So when we're thinking of about our crop planning, and when you get in these crop planning softwares, especially a lot of the free ones that are out there, they're all going to ask you, when's your first frost and when's your last frost? And then here in San Diego, that is just like such a moving target. it's so unreliable. And yeah, I see some heads nodding for sure because I even at Farm Lab and Encinitas, it's like we get frosts, but they're not consistent. And I'm like, I can really rely on one probably by like Christmas time, but sometimes they happen earlier. At Wild Willow, we got it as early as like mid-September one year. And so there have been all of our summer crops. So thinking of that like last end date, if we don't have that hard frost date to end our season, like we kind of need to be our own hard frost date and like end our own season. And that's like a healthy thing to do for us and for us to be able to move on to other crops. There is like a fun and a joy to like try and get everything you can out of the crops you have. And that's really great if you have a lot of space. But if you're limited on space, trying to get the last like few pints of cherry tomatoes to sell at your farmer's market that maybe aren't even that great anyways, but you can get a couple extra. It's like we're taking up bed space of something that could be turned around and planted and be made profitable in a short amount of time. So by harvesting a lot right now, we're robbing ourselves of that like future income. So if you have bed space, it works really well. But if you're short on bed space, it's like really thinking of like turning those crops and also thinking about in terms of like our soil health too, of like, a tomato crop gets kind of spindly and it's not that sexy looking. And like, is it really doing something for the soil or is the soil just bare? And like, would it rather just have around a cover crop in there before you plant it? So yeah, choose your kind of like summer end date and kind of plan for that, at least plan for it. And then it can, life happens. And so if your cucumbers hang around or your zucchini lasts a little bit longer and they're doing well, great. And you have some flexibility, we can do that. But otherwise, planning for that. So these are going to affect mainly I'm looking here, cucurbits, tomatoes, and our main items. For example, today I wanted to just do 2 items at least. So let's go ahead and we're going to choose a summer crop and a winter crop for that. Um, and let's do cucumbers because I feel really fun with cucumbers lately. So um, we're talking about our last frost. And so I'm curious, and if anyone's on the call too, of have you had your frost? Did you get your frost up there, Corey and Jess? I heard that Ramona got really cold Friday night and that they were maybe expecting a first frost.
I think there was one.
I think it got down to like 45
Yeah,
on
but
Sunday, but I don't think it got frosty here yet.
we had like a crazy hailstorm at the beginning of August, so that had to have frozen because it like hailed for half an hour, and then it just started raining and flooding everywhere. So I
I
don't
mean,
know
that
that. Yeah.
physical damage to the crop is hail.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that like because like it comes up in flowers a lot is like your frost hardy versus like cold hardy plants. And so what are the plants? Hi, Sienna. Um, what are the plants that can handle like, oh, it's got a little cold, but like I'm gonna still be fine versus like um I'm just got a little cold, I'm done, I'm dead, you know. So like basil is like a really sensitive crop that if it did get cold enough, it would just go. So knowing our different crops,
Oh,
yeah, especially if things are like trellised up and that cold air settles really down, it's like the roots and the soil is probably really warm. But it's like if the leaves themselves are getting frozen and damaged and crinkled so that they can't photosynthesize anymore. So sometimes if those are up and out of that frost zone, they'll be good. Yes, we're talking about first seasonality of crops. We're getting into our summer crop to see what is our seasonality across the region, choosing our hard end date. We don't always have a frost date that puts the end of our season. And so something we have to be our own frost date. Cruel. But like, and that's so yeah, asking if here, have we had our first frost yet? But usually I would anticipate um, a first frost typically in cucumbers around right about now. So that like middle of October. I've seen it as early as mid-September down in the Tijuana River Valley where we farmed. It's a very, very low spot. And so you have Tecate Mountain, Tecate Peak. So when it's really, really cold up top and the mountains, that cold air settles and falls into our lower little valleys and dips. And so depending on where your plants are, they could be up on a hillside where they're never in that little dip. So they're not going to get cold. But like Farm Lab Field 1 there, right by the apple trees, that's very cold down there. So that's where we get frozen hoses and stuff.
It was pretty frosty this morning.
Oh,
I
was
don't
it
know if
really?
it was on your side, but yeah, like we have been experimenting with, we did like a late planting of cucumbers. I
Ah,
did harvest today, and I'm curious to see what happens if we get any more. And they're all like really short and fat. Like I think it's too cold for them, but
mm,
yeah, they were pretty frosty this morning. So we'll
that'll
see.
be interesting. When you see cucumbers, they just their leaves turn black. So they're like, nope, done. They
Yeah,
got hit.
they're getting a little wilty, so
Yeah.
I don't think they love it.
Yeah.
That's so,
Go ahead, Sienna.
sorry, I was gonna say that's so wild that we're so close and we have not had frost yet. And it's just like that microclimate, I think, of you guys being in the little valley.
Yep.
Yeah.
So yeah, because Sienna, I don't know if you would ever get a frost because you're like kind of up on that hillside and you do have a lot of breeze and wind. So you might not ever get a frost there. Um, Definitely up in Laguna, you snow.
Yeah.
The Julian area. Yeah, I know Rachel's off camera and stuff, but I'd be curious too. I know she's been up there for a couple years in like kind of that alpine crest area, and it's like a couple thousand feet. What's your elevation there, Rachel?
I'm at 1,500 feet, and we haven't gotten a frost yet, but yeah, we usually get, I don't know, 6 or 7, I think, in the year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it comes too with those storms. So what happens is usually it rains and the cold front comes in, and then as soon as those clouds clear, that's when like it drops really fast. So I always expect that first frost, and so that's why we had like a little tiny system that came through Thursday night. And I know it sneezed somewhere around the county, but that's the kind of system that we anticipate bringing these cold temperatures. Um, so yeah, for planning purposes, I don't try and plan on things past October because it's risky, right? Everything in farming is risky. And so I'm going to go ahead and start highlighting back from this like mid October for my cucumbers. And then, oh, this is going to be a question for Hannah because they really pushed the envelope. This is why I chose cucumbers too. Um, on their planting date, I was actually down at my friend's farm in National City and talking to them about when do you seed your warm season crops. And it's kind of interesting because it's CMU Seed Company, they try and do their tomatoes like really early, but then it's like kind of the earlier you do them, it like doesn't really make a difference. You're still going to get them fruiting at the same time, and so might as well seed them, the tomatoes specifically, when they're going to do really well, which is like warm soil temps and like sunshine and doing good. But cucumbers, yeah, talking with Beth, I was always like March 15th is when I put my Kirkovits in the ground and I direct seed them. That was like my go-to. And she's like, oh yeah, me too. But now with climate change, I'm doing the first week of March. And so I was like, oh, well, that's fascinating. And then Farm Lab, you want to say, you guys ran into a happy little accident with your cucumbers. Can you want to share about that?
Was that about the seeds that
Yeah.
now I'm like, what happened? Well, we had the 2 successions that got eaten, so we seeded them really late. But then I guess it was the beginning of this year, we accidentally somehow like whole bag of cucumbers got wet, and so we ended up seeding them really early.
Like
But
January, wasn't it? Like first week of
yeah, I was
January?
gonna say January or February. Like it was early. Like we were like, well, we just have to seed them because we'll see what happens. And they were fine, and they did great, and they like produced a monstrous amount of cucumbers. So
Yeah.
like we were drowning in cucumbers. We didn't know what to do.
Yeah.
And your tomatoes, right? I remember coming in like January, February, and we were doing a lot of the
We also seeded our tomatoes early because they got wet. We had
Yeah.
some issues with the cooler and things getting wet, and then we figured out what was going on. But the tomatoes didn't do as well. We think that tomatoes were seeded too early and they were a little stressed and they didn't produce as much as last year. Even though we had more tomato plants than like we planted more tomatoes than last year. But the cucumbers were fine.
Yeah. And so those ended up, they probably ended up in the ground in like March, and you got cucumbers in like April, I want to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it was when the kids were on spring break, which was I think it was in April.
Yeah, would have been like the first or second week in April.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And so when I'm doing this, I am highlighting the season where I'm harvesting. So we're not talking about, we are talking about our seeding dates and stuff right now. That's going to come more in play when we're actually doing our crop plan. This is like harvest. So when are we going to be thus the harvest calendar for how many cucumbers? But the tomatoes, I mean, that just like brought up that interesting thing too, though, of like, okay, this is what cucumbers did this year, right? But that's not always, we are just growing in a time when things are so different. The tomatoes came up too because I don't know anybody. Like I know Food Shed was having a really hard time finding somebody who would give them tomatoes. I didn't get any big tomatoes in my CSA box at all this summer. So I think it was a rough season for tomatoes. And I've heard that before. It's just like somehow with like how much marine layer we have, the coolness, or how hot, it was a milder summer actually. So it really wasn't as hot as other summers. There's all these different climactic facts. For flowers, our ranunculus came a month earlier before they've really ever have, and then we're out before Mother's Day. And it was like we've always, everyone always has ranunculus on Mother's Day. And so this season was just like it started really early, at least for the flowers. And so it makes this planning piece hard. So you're like, is it normal that I can get cucumbers in April, or is that like an exception to the rule, right? So we're on like planning purposes. And so, I always like to think of it like, how much do I want to push it on something? I don't want to push my limits on any crops. Like, it's like, okay, as we gain our experience, and it's like, man, I know my cabbage. Like me and cabbage, we get each other. And this is when I seed it, and I'm confident in my cabbage. The other ones I'm going to be like risking. And it's like, but I love cabbage so much. How can I possibly get cabbage so that I'm harvesting it in October? Like how are we wanting to like push our shoulder seasons? And that's traditionally been the way to get an edge at a farmer's market. So if you're thinking like, I will say JR gets me every time. They're the first with zucchini every single year. They're so good. They've been growing for so long, and they know how to grow their zucchini in tunnels and grow a lot of it and grow it really well. And so that's definitely a thing for them. I know I'm going to go to their farmer's market stall because I know they have zucchini the earliest, and it's my favorite veggie. And so I'm going to go there for my zucchini. And now I'm going to be buying their other things that they have there as well. And so same with like strawberries. That's that's a nice one. Like, oh, can you have strawberries at your stand before somebody else? And then you're kind of like, now you're the place to get that crop. That's really shifted as we have this like whole globalized food economy now, where you can get strawberries somehow like year round. or zucchini year round. But that traditionally has been that way to like, how can I like push my shoulder season crops? And so if is that a mindset that you want to continue for your farm, like how do I push my shoulders to have cucumbers as long as possible and broccoli as long as possible so that you can be having a year-round like CSA subscription? Or are you trying to think of like, no, I want to be really reasonable here and be right sized, so I don't want to be pushing it. So that's some of these considerations for when you'd want to push stuff or not push stuff. I don't know, does anyone want to say anything else about like, do you want to push it? Do you want to like really want to get something? Having a crop, any sentiments around your excitement for crops? When you would blur the line and make an exception? Cool. Okay, so now we have our cucumbers here. And so we have our season planned for the year. This is now when we know we can harvest cucumbers. CSA is going to be really different from our non-CSA. Depending on the CSA customer you're cultivating too, right? And so I was up in Humboldt, and that community of people wanted a lot of food. It's like that was the food they ate, and they were feeding their family, and like they really didn't mind getting cucumbers every single week for 26 weeks for the extent of their CSA. Whereas I feel like here in the city in San Diego, I find well, I guess me personally, I'm like, please don't give me cucumbers every week. I don't want any cucumbers. I can just get them from Farm Lab. So, but thinking of that, you probably aren't going to want to be sending your cucumbers every single week. And so that makes a challenge, right? So if you're like, okay, how am I setting up my CSA? So if I'm going to be a cucumber plant's going to like, it peaks, right? So, and now we're thinking of our succession planning. So again, this is getting a little ahead into our crop planning, but as we are in our harvest calendar here, we can say, from our experience, we've learned we can get these cucumbers to pump out, 20 pounds. Like, this is CSA. So it's like, I want to plan to have, 25 pounds, 1 pound per box. And I know in the springtime, man, those things pump, and I'm going to get 5 weeks of cucumbers, and they're going to just peter off. And then I really want to give my customers a break. And now I know that my cucumbers in the summertime months, those really only produce for like 2, maybe 3 weeks. And so if I'm planning successions, I'll say, let's give them, 25 here, and then another 25 here, and 25 here. And I really don't love cucumbers. I don't want to push it into the winter months. And that's different than say what Farm Lab's got going on, which is they don't want any cucumbers in the summer because there's no kids on campus in the summer, but they really need to push their shoulder seasons. Yeah, push it as early as possible because the kids are here in session in this like spring and early summer, late spring, and in this fall season too. So, they're concerned with getting cucumbers in those shoulder seasons specifically. I probably bring Farm Lab up a lot just because I love how unique and constrained it is. It's like they want their tomatoes through their summer break, which is like mid-June through like early August, but like tomatoes do not start coming in until late July in San Diego. And it's just like, how do you try and like squeeze all your tomato production here? It's like one of those good tools to just, now we can inform our customer, sorry, we're not going to have tomatoes in June. It's just like not possible. But you can expect them here. And so now our customer, like the kitchen there, just knows. She's like, okay, in August, I'm just going to hire an extra person, have an extra set of hands, because that's when I'm getting my tomatoes. And then they can plan for that. So yeah, it's like as we're planning for back to cucumbers, we have our 25 pounds here. If we pop onto our non-harvest calendar. You can like copy and paste this like coloring probably. Let's see, you know, imperfect system. But that was like early April. So just to like layer on this element of the secondary need for our cucumbers. So CSA is very specific, whereas a restaurant, maybe they want, they're like, I'm solid. I've used cucumbers all the time to on my salads, and any extras I have, I always just pickle them and then I keep them stocked up for my charcuterie boards. And so, if you can reliably think of like, okay, I can do 10 pounds every week to these customers, my wholesale, then that's great. That's why farmers markets really nice too, because you can kind of consistently plan on your farmers market customers to like be purchasing. But a secondary effect of like having this outlet of a farmer's market is great. Maybe a gleaner, someone like Corey and Jess, who are like, oh, you have all these cucumbers and you here in this third week of June, and you're not going to be giving it to your CSA customers, but it's a dwindled number. They're not perfect. That's great. Like, let's give it to the food preserver people so that they can be using those cucumbers. You're not trying to off put them on your CSA customers, and it's not like you're stuck with them. Farmers markets are a really good catch all for your overages of your crops. But like thinking, kind of having this plan in advance of like, where are your overages going? So I'm going to try and say that all again because it's an important kind of like laddering of crops. But Hannah, I saw you come off mute. Did you have a question or contribution?
Yeah, well, actually, I was wondering if you could just, I guess I have a question about how you're planning like the amounts that you're entering, because like for the CSA versus non-CSA, are you thinking like for this calendar specifically, are you thinking, okay, if I have this many customers, I'm expecting like when you put those 25 pounds in, is that I'm expecting I'll be able to get 25 pounds a week from this bed, or I'm like, are you planning it based on how much you're growing, or are you planning it based on your customer of like, I need 25 pounds of this to meet the CSA of my need? And then how are you looking at that for non-CSA? Like, I'm curious, I actually am a little confused where the number is coming from. Is it?
Perfect. Thank you. So yeah, we're planning for our customers' needs.
Okay.
And then our next in a couple classes, we'll see how much bed space, it's going to take. That's like one of these challenges that we have is like the chicken before the egg. It's like, here's our customer plan for their needs, and then see how much bed space we need and massage the plan backwards if needed. Another strategy could be to be like, I'm just going to put 100, bed feet of cucumbers in, and, then I'll find a sales channel for those. I kind of know they're going to go here and here. And so those are two different approaches to the farming. And I think it depends on what your outlets are, a CSA is probably your most tight armed, like you need to have a certain number of items. There's some flexibility. So, I'm planning for an 8-item CSA box, but I'm going to probably plan to have 9 items. So if one of those fails, 9 to 10, I'll at least have 8 items in that box. But yeah, we're starting from our customer. Okay, we're going to get 25 pounds here. And then, add into our other market streams that we have that we know we're going to be producing for. This gets kind of to your question though, too. I think for somewhere where you're at, Hannah, you're kind of trying to think of like the scale of your farm and how much. There are some like rough numbers out there to say X amount of acreage can produce for this amount of CSA. And so, I think of Grow Eco. They are doing probably 35 member CSA every week. They have like 60 members or something, but are only really producing 35, equivalent of 35 a week. And that's on about half an acre. And he produces every other week to a farm stand and delivers to food shed pretty frequently. So that's kind of my understanding too, is that like a half acre is a comfortable size for, a 30 to 50 member CSA. But it just varies so much in terms of like your intensity too of your planning. So because I think that's where you're kind of getting at this too. It's like, wait, how much should I be ballparking for?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I've been working on a lot, is like that question. But you did answer my other question, because I just for a moment I was like, wait, where is she pulling these numbers from?
Yes,
Are they one or the other? But this makes sense. And then like we're going into this feeds into the other side of crop planning after.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so yeah, this like is this like non-CSA harvest calendar. This is gonna be nice on like your farmers markets really too, and your wholesale markets. So it really does come to like, I just know a chef and they want this amount of salad mix from me every week. And so, and these other crops. And so you can have these conversation with your chefs. Don't write them in stone, because most chefs will, you come with your produce. You're like, you said you wanted all these like shishito peppers. Here you go. And they're like, that chef left and I don't like shishito peppers. That happens pretty often in the farming world. But I think we're getting better that there are tons of chefs out there, so you can find a new chef connection. Sienna, I saw you come off mute.
Yeah, I was just wondering why you made the distinction specifically between CSA harvest and then like everything else.
I did that primarily because a CSA requires like a minimum like number of items and a lot of planning. And so I pulled it out separate just so that I could be keeping track of it up here and this number of items per week. And that's probably a level of detail that, can be sacrificed in your first couple iterations of this. But like and because I don't think anyone here really is so much of a CSA farm, but if you really are planning to be a CSA farm and have everything come from you, it's like being so on the dot with making sure you have enough crops at any given time. It's an equivalent for our flower farm of our bouquets. And so it's like we have, and if that spreadsheet's in there, it's like our focals, our secondaries, our fillers, our greens. And it's like at any given time of the year, we need to make sure that we have these different flowers to function in a bouquet so that we can be making bouquets. Especially for us, because we have very limited to no options about what we can buy in for our bouquets. And that's, I think that used to be true for CSAs, but now I feel like, having a contingency of just relationships with other farmers tends to work a lot better. You're like, oh, I'm short on items. And you're like, oh, let me call up my friends and be like, hey, do you got anything extra this week? They're like, so many carrots. And you're like, perfect. I'll buy those carrots in from you. And so that's like one of those mentalities too that I think I was touching on, is just like kind of what kind of farmer do you want to be? Do you want to be that farmer that's trying to grow everything? Do you want to be that farmer that pushes your seasons? Or do we want to say, hey, I want to like, just be in a zone where I feel really comfortable and I'm super confident I can just like buy stuff in and, yeah. But yeah, that's the reason for the differentiation. It's here if you want it. Otherwise, just working from this non-CSA and kind of functioning in one space, I think is cool too. So yeah, because then this too requires that secondary level of like, okay, I'm adding this. An alternative too is even if you wanted to add like another row for like cucumbers, for your CSA, you can do that as well. So that right below it, you know, you can be saying, well, I want 10 for my restaurants, and then here, you know, I want my 25 pounds.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, layered in. Yeah, you know, because this is really, it's a tool. You can make of it what you want. I think at a minimum, using it just for the color coding to understand where your season is. And then like a secondary piece is like popping numbers in, and um, if that's going to like help keep track of things for you. Whereas like my brain tends to keep all the numbers in my head all the time anyways. So I don't really need to be writing it here because it's like in my head. But if I need to be coordinating and like, hey, let me show another member of my team these numbers that I'm thinking, like, does this seem, you know, on par with this numbering?
Yeah.
You know, this, it's a nice way to break up the crop planning so that we're saying like, okay, now we are talking about what are our sales needs, and then when we do crop planning we can talk about, you know, succession planning and seeding dates and those things. These are just such huge conversations to like have as a team. A crop plan really becomes like, it's such a mind map, I find, and it's really hard to like necessarily welcome somebody into your mind space because we all just think so differently and process information differently. And so the harvest calendar is a nice tool to collaborate on, to be like, okay, these are our seasons. We all agree that's our season, right? Okay, and these are the numbers we're going for. Okay, yeah, that sounds about right. These are our customers. Here's our common ground, and then leave it to somebody else to have one person just be doing all the actual like seating dates and numbers and successions, and trusting that person to like hit these goals. So our harvest calendar is kind of a way to set a goal and agree on that, and then let somebody else kind of go to town on knowing the successions and um, creating that mind map. So that's what it is. And we'll go, you know, when we look at our crop plans, it's like you can be spreadsheet person, you can be tend person, and yeah, it's it gets kind of complicated. So how do we, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'd imagine this is also a helpful tool for comparison between like what you planned or what your goal was versus what you actually got later on.
Mm-hmm. Especially as we don't, with the flowers, like we just didn't know so much about growing these flowers. Like it's embarrassing how little we knew about growing flowers before we started growing them. Because I wanted to think of it as their same seasons. We have warm season and cool season, just like veggies. And with flowers, it's like, oh no, you have like cold season annuals, cold hardy ones, warm hardy, frost hardy, and just like, you know, early season summer annuals, late season summer annuals. And so I was like, oh wow, there's like 6 different seasons for flowers, whereas I feel like veggies is kind of, you know, warm season, cool season, and shoulder seasons. Um, so yeah, so it helps to like plan it. This is what I think is going to happen, and I actually go in probably around mid in June, and I like check in, and I like go and I like update. I'm like, oh yeah, no, we didn't get those then, and this is when this happened. But then again, we have things like climate change that just throws everything for a ringer. And one year we got our feverfew here, and the next year we got our feverfew like 6 weeks later. So it's like, it's almost like impossible to plan when to have specific flower crops, at least. So, yeah, but I did want to touch on it's nice to see this here, this like stacking function as we're planning. Just like copy paste this over. So we kind of got into that when we were talking with our market streams. about like how do our markets like support one another. Like the way we do it at Be Worthy, it's like we wholesale most of our flowers. That's our most profitable thing. And then we flowers that don't sell or we have extra of, now we get to make bouquets out of. And then the flowers that we have left over from that, we just like give to the tiny farm, and the tiny farm makes whatever profit they can off of them, and then they get donated to our friends in the community. And so that's like our channel. Sometimes we'll when there's overages, they also go to Barbara from BCK will take our extra flowers out to a donation center, to like a church where they do food giveaways, and give our flowers out there. It's like developing that waste chain and optimizing those chains, and like thinking of how does our produce like flow, and like what is our like main priority, and then like how do we like filter that excess down. Part of this, like especially getting going, it's like having to get comfortable with waste. I learned Charlotte Smith, she's got a podcast, The Profitable Farmer Mindset. She was saying about this concept of like starting simply, and like just having to kind of accept that like we're not going to have all the market channels, not everything's going to be in place. We're trying to go enough of something so that we can have it when we need it. And so getting comfortable with having that your first year. And if you're not comfortable with it, it's like really making it a point then to find, there's gleaner groups out there. There's people that ferment. There's WhatsApp groups that you can kind of be a part of. Like you're not always going to find that high value dollar buyer that wants your excess. You know, your primary buyers are going to be the ones that you were planning ahead for. So I'm like, I know Native Poppy, they're going to want like all my dahlias that I could ever produce. And I know wedding florists will take every single white scabiosa I have in like May. So like I'm going to plan for them. And if I have extra, this is where they're going to go. So this just like comes up specifically with, I'm going to add another row in here, and we're going to add food shed in here, because I know some food shed farmers are probably going to be listening in on this too. Food shed has it set up so that you are like trying to sign up and bidding for certain days, and you like say, oh, I can do my 100 pounds here, and you know they have their availability, and you're like, I know I can really crank out cucumbers, so I'm going to sign up for all my cucumbers over here, like a lot of them. And so the trouble is if you are trying to like sign up for random sets of cucumbers, oh my God, I'm going to do that cucumbers and that cucumbers, and over here, these cucumbers. And so, you know, food shed's trying to work on their back end. So if you're going to be voting and bidding for a certain like crop, they're not going to ideally be giving you these random 100 cucumbers here. You're ideally going to be getting these 100 cucumbers, so that when you're planting in your one succession, I can just plant one really big succession. I'm going to get all these cucumbers here, and then not try and hit these random 100s, because trying to zone in on getting 100 cucumbers on this Tuesday of week 25 is just like extraordinarily difficult as like a small farmer. It's like having this, it's so much easier to either plan for like, I'm just going to consistently have cucumbers. I want to just be succession planning so that I always have cukes, and like maybe I'll have a little bit excess some weeks, but my plan is to always have cucumbers, because it's just easier to just try and always have cucumbers than to like hit specific dates. Go back to the CSA we talked about. CSA is nice. Like if they get their cukes on week 25 instead of week 23, no big deal. Like they're a forgiving customer. But when we have these contracts to be growing a large amount of produce on a very specific day, that's like really challenging. And if you miss this day and you're like, oh, well, now my cucumbers actually came in week 27, not week 25. Food Shed's going to do their best to try and move those cukes for you, but like you're not guaranteed. You could be sitting on like a lot of cucumbers. So, I know not all of you are like planning to grow for Food Shed, but for the folks that are listening to this later on and it's just something really, really important that I wanted to communicate to our Food Shed farmers is like really thinking of like trying to plan for your succession and then like laddering that up with other stuff, like, well, I know I want my CSAs here, so I'm going to not try and push for these random dates. Like I'm going to be planning and bidding for my Food Shed crops based on when I know I can do these crops the best, or in a way that it's like, I'm just going to be doing 100 pounds all the time. And, sometimes my restaurants will get it, sometimes they won't. They're my forgiving customer, but I have this other great farmers market outlet where I know I'm like, I can always sell any of my extras. So does that make more sense on like the stacking functions and like the risks associated with trying to plan for very specific dates? Okay, glad to see some nods. That's a big point I wanted to bring in.
Yeah, you touched on it a little bit because you mentioned like your certain flower crops can be like 6 weeks different from your turn. And I'm curious, like, I wonder if there are projections or models, like how does someone plan for that? I this last weekend actually just got to go to Bill the Bull Baron, since I've spoke about him so many times in this group. I actually got to go up to the farm outside of Santa Cruz this weekend, and I was there for a wedding, and I hyped up the flower farm, and I told all my friends, I was like, oh, it's this gorgeous farm, and we should, take a little field trip over there, and it'll be full of the narcissus will be starting to bloom. And we got there, and nothing was blooming. And it's so wild because I looked through, my Google Photos every year, looking at the timeline, and October should have been full of tons of different varieties of narcissus, but there was absolutely nothing going on, and doesn't even look like it will be for like weeks. So it's almost like a 2 month delay or something. And I'm just curious, like in this planning and forecasting, like how do we even try to make those projections? It seems so challenging.
It is challenging. And Corey, I kind of want you to jump in too. If you can just share about what's been happening up in Julian with some of the different like early or late frosts. Haven't you been like losing some like big crops up there because of like early blooming or something? Maybe you know a little bit more about that.
Yeah, the temperature swings have been just so all over the place that most of the apple and pear crops have they've lost like 80 to 90% of the crops because that I mean I was gone most of the summer, but hearing from all the different orchards, like they had a random frost in June, I believe, and then we had the hailstorm, which actually knocked a lot of the fruit that still survived off, so they lost a lot from that. And yeah, it's just like it's so crazy, especially with fruit when you only have like one time of year to harvest it, that like those big weather changes can cause such destruction. I mean, we had one year where there was a really late frost in, actually, no, it was a really early frost in about a May, I think it was. And like almost everybody lost their crops. Like it was right when everything was flowering, got a frost, killed everything. Like barely any harvest was available. And it was just so crazy to see all these farms up here like, okay, we don't know what to do. Like we're not making any money this year. And it just seems like it's getting wilder and wilder as we live up here. It's just like, oh, usually it's not too bad. And then it's just like, I don't know what to expect really. Like, who knows what the weather's going to do and how it's going to affect us.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, and yeah, I wanted you to share that 'cause it's like Rachel, I don't know if people have an answer. it's like the old timer farmers, like, I mean, you could just like grow things on clockwork, from my understanding, growing up in the Midwest. Like you would have like these exceptions, but it's like you knew your like you corn planting date, and it's like, oh, if it was like a really wet winter, maybe it would push it a little back and forth. But yeah, with these climate changes, I think it's just happening more frequently. So for them up there, it's like if it's really, really wet in the spring, there's not enough like warm summer days. So if you can't get your corn in by X date, you aren't growing corn that year. And so, but then the perk of that was my uncle actually, they planted cover crop instead of corn. Um, and then they were like, wow, the soybean crop we planted the next year there was just like the best crop ever. And I was like, I know, uncle, like grow cover crop, it's great. And he's like, no. you know this is your thing of like that profitability and how do you pull stuff out of production. That's a tangent, but yeah, really trying to plan for that various times. I mean, that's where I think it's not so much on the farmer, it's like customer education. It's like educating that customer that like you're not going to have what you want when you want it necessarily. And having them feel things like no apple picking and julienne. Like I wish that was like more widespreadly known. That's like I think you had a pretty tough year this year up there because there just wasn't the crop. And like these are old pastimes that people want to experience, but like they need to know it viscerally. They need to just like not have tomatoes in your CSA box, to be like, what's going on? To like really face these like climate challenges. Or I mean, the people in the Tijuana River Valley know it with the floodings that happen so consistently now. So how do you plan for it? I mean, we're just become more resilient as farmers. We grow more diversity of things. um, Trying to save out seeds for crops that can be, maybe you had like a light frost and like one cucumber plant survived. Like save those seeds, like, oh, let's find that one's a little bit more resilient. Like, let me save those crops that are going to become like we can kind of make endemic to the area and that will do really well. And so I'm hoping there's more work, and I know there will be, on creating seed resilience in our region, especially in the face of climate change. But yeah, planning for our market, they just need to start understanding the realities, and we all get to do our part in educating the consumer. Cool. Time has been flying. I didn't know I could talk so much about harvest calendar. I thought this was going to be an early class. So we talked about this like summer time frame, but I'm also wanting to talk about winter crops. Who has winter crops in the ground right now? And you all were trying to push. I remember kind of giving you a hard time, being like, "You're trying to grow broccoli year round."
Yeah, it hasn't been super successful.
Yeah,
but now, like, I feel like the time it took for us to realize that it was like time to start, like it's getting colder, so we were like, well, we're not going to stop now because it's hopefully going to get better. But yeah, broccoli, cauliflower, and cabbage we have been growing since spring, and like the cabbage was like decent, but the broccoli and cauliflower has been very, very spotty, even though it's supposed to be like a more of like a heat resistant year. Yeah, they weren't happy.
Yeah, and it's so fascinating because it's like here we are in San Diego, and we're kind of like, oh no, you don't harvest broccoli after May even or June, like harvest wise. But then up in like Humboldt, it's like in the middle of summer, it's like their broccoli's like, I do great all year round. And you're like, awesome, broccoli in Humboldt. Yeah. Um,
Yeah. Well, our original like consultant who helped us do the crop plan, he grows in Arizona. So a part of me wonders if, like relatively speaking, our climate is much cooler and much more mild. And yeah, part of me wonders if he thought like, oh yeah, it'll grow here. But like every farmer I know that's grown in coastal like San Diego, you don't grow broccoli in the winter.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty much trying to think. I was just talking with Emily about the broccoli. I feel like broccoli and cabbage are one that you can kind of push. But really like mid-May. I feel like Emily was even like, it's not even worth it. For her, I would say for Farm Lab, right? It's not a primary crop for you guys. And so you're like, we're not going to push it. If you wanted to push it for your CSA customers, like, I mean, I know Andy was giving me broccoli in like June and he's growing out in Ramona. And so I know you can really push this. I also know Andy he's putting a lot of fertility and care into his brassica plants. And so to keep them from getting stressed, because you're really going to be just getting into aphid land in this like late season plantings of your cool season stuff. So I guess we're kind of on this trend of like, when's the last you can have this? But Andy too, gosh, man, this guy, we all need to learn how to grow from Andy because I've got Brussels sprouts in my CSA box last week, and somehow he has been growing Brussels sprouts all summer long off the same plants in Ramona. I think minus when there was like a crazy heat wave. It's just like he's like, I don't know. I don't know how it's happening. And it's just it's wild. So yeah, we can all learn how to grow. And I just got so he's an advanced farmer. So, if we're saying really kind of planning wise, maybe like May here for our cabbage and broccoli, but then come Andy just dropped it in my box last week. So that's second week of October. And that sounds about right, actually. So you can start, maybe cabbage isn't quite there yet though. I feel like broccoli is a quicker one. But yeah, for broccoli, you can see it as early as this October timeframe. And when you're thinking of this broccoli in your specific microclimate, I like broccoli as the example because it's kind of like a cut and come again one. You can get the main head of broccoli, and then if you harvest really far down onto it, it's going to make some really nice chunky side shoots, or if you harvest shallow, you can get lots of small side shoots. So that's why you can kind of really extend your season here depending on how well you care for your broccoli and cabbage. Because I was getting a lot of those side shoots of cabbage from Andy as well, like into June and July. So you harvest that main head of cabbage, keep it in the ground, makes those little cute little, they're actually the perfect size cabbage, the little side shoots of the cabbage, my favorites. So if you have the bed space. Yeah, so you're thinking on that as the plant is mature, what is your propensity for getting like aphids, cabbage moths? Like the plants is going to get stressed because it's hotter, and so if you can keep that plant going a little bit longer into the warm season by giving it really good fertility or overhead watering or what have you, like whatever's going to be your tactic for extending that season and keeping that plant healthy, that's going to push you further into these summer months. And then so that's on the mature side. On the young side, we're talking about seeding to get this in October, we're seeding in July for sure. I'm always seeding my brassicas. Usually personally, I'm seeding in first week of August for my first brassicas. Because this October has been pretty nice. We have lots of cool evenings. But sometimes our Octobers can be super, super hot. And so it's how much of a risk do you want to play in your broccoli game? Because those plants can get really stressed out in October. But again, if you have good fertility, use shade cloth, they're going to be happy plants. And then just to note, it's not so much of an issue. The Bagrata bug was a huge pest problem. And so we were down in Wild Willow. I know this was elsewhere. This was maybe 8 years ago. I'm not sure. but those bagrata bugs came out at this time, like September, October, and they just annihilated every brassica everywhere, and they just kept replicating, and like the numbers were insane. So that those bagrata bug problems have influenced how I view my like early winter plantings of things. And I think it's probably almost 7 because I'm coughing. Yeah, I've talked so much. Usually I invite more discussion. But yeah, so that's kind of like my take on this, like the winter season though. It's like you can kind of push to get this harvest in October, and that's really, it's a good date to push for because you're noticing down here I might get that first frost and I kind of need this main items, to be in my box at that time because fennel and kohlrabi are usually some of those like crops that you can like guarantee to have in this time frame. But like, you know, Sienna, you know about kohlrabi. Nobody wants your kohlrabi.
No, it's sad.
I mean, they're great, but like they're just not selling for your at your farm stand, right? Yeah.
Yeah, which is a pity because they're one of our most consistent growers.
Yeah. 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 So it's, it is good to think of warm season, cold season, then what are these shoulder crops that can kind of do well in this like uncertainty period. So as we're planning and you're doing your crop plans, your harvest calendars, it's like I kind of like to think of my favorites. What are those ones? And then it's like, how am I filling in these gaps? And you're like, okay, I really can't nail those items at that time, but I can get this arugula and lettuce. Like I know how to get those really good right now. Your beets and your carrots. And we didn't even get to talk about those, but radishes are always there. So it's like sometimes I always keep radish in my back pocket when I'm thinking of like a CSA model. That's going back into the CSA framework. It's like I need items at this time, or I need my farmer's market stand to be really full. And it's like, even if I don't have the best things, how can I make it look full still? So, so yeah, when you're thinking of, that's why it's just so important to understand. It's like, you have to customize this for who your sales channel is. I think that's all I have to offer for content, but open for any questions. Your homework is to keep chugging on this. Finish it if you can, at least with the colors. Add numbers if it's like that's something accessible to you all, but at least color coding.
This is such a helpful visual.
It goes a lot quicker than you think it's going to go. And this is good too, especially, I think of you, Sienna, as you're getting into understanding like all these crops, and you may not know it, but like you can probably sit next to Greg and be like, hey Greg, can you just talk to me about arugula? Like, how did arugula do? Like, when do you like growing it? When do you not like growing it?
Mhm.
You're just like, they're like, yep, okay, all these. And you can just like track his brain for him during those times. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
It's like, you're not actually doing planning work. We're just chatting here.
Yeah. It's usually disguised as like a field walk
Yeah.
when we get all the things discussed.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Walking and talking rather than trying to sit somewhere. Because sometimes that's like a cautionary tale too, is like, I mean, how much do we want to talk about arugula? Like, I mean, we really like arugula. Do we like it spicy level? Do we like it spicy or do we not like it spicy? It's really sweet at this time of year. I can get 3 cuts at this time, 2 cuts on this time. Like how much information do you really want to be going into on these? Because when you're starting to add these crops up, like that's a lot. It's a lot of conversation time, which is, I wish there were more rainy days in San Diego to invite us into this planning work a little easier.
I have a question about like your record keeping in relation
Mm.
to these. So do you make like you do like a 2022, 2023, like do you kind of keep, because you said you make notes on it based on what actually happened. Do you do that in the same one and then like make a new one for the next year? Or like how do you kind of, yeah, how do you keep your records with it to be able to look back at what happened and reference?
So there's the ideal, which we use Tend software. And so in my ideal world, um, we can go into regularly into our crop document, pull that up and be like, adjust. I harvested this March 10th, and whenever it ended, I would be in, yeah, that's my last harvest, and it's all in my Tend software. The reality of that is that Tend is slow AF. And to go and make those adjustments, it's just like you click one thing and it's like loading, loading, loading. You're like, okay, enter it in, saving, saving, saving. And like that amount of drudgery, we talked about joy versus drudgery in our matrix. It's like that's like too much drudgery for that to be a functional one. And so I have this thing I made. Boop, magically appears. This is showing my like crop tracking sheets. This didn't actually get fully implemented and realized on the farm, but for me, a lot of stuff is in my head. My brain can just really capture a ton of information. And so it's in my head, and that's cross referenced with harvest sheets. And so we have all of our harvest sheets available. And so it's not my favorite, but it's least chronological. And I can go back, and if when I'm thinking about Cosmos, I can go back on my harvest sheets and being like, oh yeah, see, this is when we really like, oh, they really picked up, they were on, and like, oh, I remember that those successions, they just pumped and pumped and pumped. And then it was something like the later ones didn't do good. And then I can kind of cross reference and be like, oh yeah, it was that planting planted in March, that one didn't do good. So I'm going to shift my dates. And so that's when too, we're talking about these crop plans being in a mind. It's like my mind can map it and has all this information, but that's not always really helpful when I'm trying to like work with somebody else and they're trying to contribute or feel like they can contribute. So, this was one of my ways to like have other people have their thoughts put on. It's like, what pest and disease, like just making lots of notes about the crops. And then next year, I was going to do it this year. This is like the next level stuff of understanding how much time it takes to like work with a crop. I think I was telling somebody today, we have these small 10x4s, and I threw, sunflowers in there. And then I'm like, I'm only going to make like $120 off of this. And I'm like, meanwhile, over there, that scabiosa bed, I'm going to pull like $800 off of that bed, and not have to flip it. And so, like, intuitively, maybe we can know those things as we're getting going. You're like, is this high value, not high value? Like, oh, sunflowers sell. That everybody knows sunflowers, but it's like anybody can grow sunflowers, and they can grow them for way cheaper than I can. And so I have prime real estate let me grow higher value crops in this same space. And then as I've gone on with time, this time tracking actually becomes really important, because if like, scabiose is great, but if we're harvesting it only once a week, to get 10 bunches is going to take like an hour, versus if I just harvest it 3 times a week, I can get like 10 bunches in 15 minutes, 3 times a week. So there's all these elements of it. And it's like, oh, roses, do they make sense? We have to spray them with fertility every other week to keep them alive. Like, is it worth that effort for how much money we can be pulling in on the roses? You're like, maybe that was a mistake. I don't know. Now we're trying to sell our roses as herbs. So it's like, okay, now that can justify the amount of work it takes to like grow these plants. And so sometimes we really need to see the numbers. Intuitively, we can know so much, but sometimes we really need to see the numbers to justify why we grow things. Green onions, you know, they're my favorite crop. To give an example, like they take so long to clean and process for me to get to my standard of what I think a green onion should look like. So I'm like, I can't grow green onions because it just takes way too long for me to clean them appropriately, you know? But meanwhile, like, I love how there's some like smaller hobby farmers, and I'm like, you love growing green onions. You have a lot of time. Time is a luxury for you because it's a hobby. You grow the green onions. I will grow these crops over here, you know? So it's just like kind of knowing some of those things. So this ideally is maybe what I'll do next year. So I have less in my brain because there's less and less room in there.
Mhm.
I can pop a copy of this in our folder if that would be helpful. You know, to there.
Yes, please.
Make a copy. I love all these little tools. I don't know. Sometimes they work for folks, sometimes they don't, but if they do, that's great. I also have that yeah. Oh, what was the other templates I had sent to you, Hannah? I think was the monthly meeting, to you, Sienna, as well. I think it's like, oh, what are these topics that we just need to touch on? Like every month, I need to have a pulse check on this, and this, and yeah, that's, that helps, but, doesn't address all the problems, obviously, but it at least kind of puts a place in time for some things because there's just so much to keep track of. It's an iterative process. We have to be kind to ourselves. It's like there's no perfect crop plan, but if you add colors to them, it sure makes it look pretty, Yeah. Oh my gosh, what's Rachel saying in the chat was there's a high-end ice cream shop movement that's happening. It's a great outlet for a quick sale of ripe produce since they have pressure to rotate flavors frequently. I'll have some cucumber ice cream. Cucumber gelato sounds like so good. Maybe with some honey in there and mint. Oh. Anything else top of mind? Otherwise, I might find some ice cream.
This was great. Thanks, Kat.
Yeah, it was great.
Thank you, Kat.
That's nice.
Thank
Wow.
you, thank you. I love your tools as well. They're really good.
Yeah, it's so funny. I was thinking to myself the other day, I was like, I really just need a way of laying it out and like see this. I mean, this time, this is when I can harvest it. This is when I should plant it. Like, oh man, it's perfect. It came in right when I needed it.
That's good stuff. Yeah. I mean, my mind wasn't oriented on this until I met Kara from the Ecology Center and I saw it and I was like, this exists. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Yeah. It's trying to take the brain ideas and make them tangible. So you can see it. And then it opens the brain up to do other processes. So,
Right.
yeah. Cool. All right, friends. Well, I hope everyone has a good night. Next week is another class, so spreadsheets. Bring a fresh, crisp mind, and we'll get into numbers. All right, friends.
Awesome.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Kat.
Okay.
Good night, everyone.